When people think of corruption in American police forces, one name always bubbles to the top: the LAPD. But the reputation didn't just come from a few bad apples. No, it was built brick by brick, scandal by scandal, through decades of bribery, brutality, cover-ups, and politics that turned the city's supposed protectors into its most feared gang. The deeper you go into the history of the Los Angeles Police Department, the more you realize the corruption didn't just exist, it thrived. And when people tried to clean it up, it somehow got even worse. Let's rewind to the early 1900s. Back then, LA was growing fast. Hollywood was booming, real estate was exploding, and oil was turning everyday men into millionaires. But with all that growth came chaos, and the people in power wanted control. So instead of building a police force to protect the public, LA quietly built one to protect the rich, the powerful, and the status quo. Officers weren't trained in community policing, they were trained in suppression. Suppress the workers, suppress the immigrants, suppress the noise. By the 1920s and 30s, the LAPD wasn't just corrupt, it was owned. Literally owned by politicians, business moguls, and even organized crime. Officers took payoffs from bootleggers during Prohibition. Brothels, gambling dens, and drug rings paid the cops to look the other way, or worse, to eliminate the competition. It wasn't uncommon for cops to moonlight as enforcers for mobsters. You weren't protected by the badge. You paid the badge to protect you. And at the top of this pyramid of power sat the police chiefs, who were supposed to be reformers, but were often just mobsters with better PR. Take Chief James E. Davis, who ran the department in the 30s and then again in the 40s. He didn't even try to hide his methods. He created gun squads, who were basically roving death teams that shot suspects without trials. He once bragged, "We're going to make LA so tough that criminals will fear to tread." But what he really meant was, we're going to terrorize anyone we label as a problem. The LAPD's internal system was designed to protect its own. If you were an officer who played ball, you got promoted. If you didn't, you were pushed out. Or worse, whistleblowers were harassed, demoted, or run off the force. Complaints from the public went into a black hole. Police brutality wasn't an exception, it was the rule. And communities, especially Black and Latino communities, were left to suffer under a system that treated them like enemies. Things hit a fever pitch in the 1940s when the department's racist and violent tactics collided with growing tension in LA's neighborhoods. LAPD let white servicemen beat Mexican-American youth in the streets for days, and instead of protecting the victims, they arrested the victims. During this time, the LAPD wasn't just failing to stop the violence, they were actively choosing sides. And they chose power. They always chose power. Now you'd think it couldn't get worse, right? Enter the 1950s and Chief William H. Parker. He's often remembered as the guy who cleaned up the LAPD. But here's the truth. Parker didn't fix the corruption. He just rebranded it. He kicked out some of the obvious criminals in uniform, sure, but he replaced the Wild West style of corruption with something even more dangerous: systemic oppression, hidden behind shiny new procedures and press conferences. He sold the LAPD as professional, but what he really did was make their racism and authoritarianism harder to detect. Under Parker, the department became even more militarized. He referred to LA as enemy territory and the LAPD as an army of occupation. That's a direct quote. Think about that. Police chief calling his own city an enemy. And this wasn't just rhetoric. Parker increased surveillance in minority neighborhoods, ramped up stop and frisk policies, and enforced segregation through intimidation. He built a fortress around the LAPD, an us versus them mentality that still echoes today. Then came the 60s and 70s, civil rights protests, anti-war demonstrations, and the rise of Black and Chicano activism. You know what LAPD did? They doubled down. They infiltrated activist groups, spied on community leaders, and brutally crushed peaceful protests. Police violence during this era was not accidental. It was policy. All of it justified under the guise of law and order. In the 1980s, things exploded again, literally, with the crack epidemic and the rise of gangs. But instead of addressing the root causes, poverty, redlining, and systemic neglect, LAPD launched a full-blown war on poor communities of color. SWAT raids became a spectacle. Entire blocks were treated like enemy camps. And then, of course, came Rodney King, beaten nearly to death by multiple officers in 1991, caught on camera. It was supposed to be the wake-up call, but when the officers were acquitted, LA burned, and the world finally saw what communities in LA had been screaming about for decades. And even after all that, after the riots, after the investigations, after the promises of reform, guess what? The LAPD kept falling right back into its old ways. Rampart scandal in the late 90s, a massive department-wide corruption ring where dozens of officers were caught planting evidence, selling drugs, and framing innocent people. That's not a few bad apples, that's a whole rotten orchard. The department has had waves of reform since then. New chiefs, federal oversight, community policing programs, but every time the spotlight fades, the same patterns return. Excessive force, racial profiling, officers who kill unarmed civilians and walk free, because the system isn't broken. It's doing what it was built to do, and unless that system is rebuilt from the ground up, the corruption will always come back. So when we talk about the LAPD today, we're not just talking about a police department with a few bad years. We're talking about over a century of rot, carefully protected, violently enforced, and constantly evolving to survive. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Not just the history, but the way it keeps rewriting itself to stay in power.